I recently sat down for coffee with a friend who is a voracious consumer of edutainment content. He was buzzing with excitement about a video essay he'd just watched on the concept of quantum entanglement. He described the visuals vividly: the high-end 3D animations of spinning particles, the dramatic background music, the charismatic narrator. He kept saying, "It finally clicked. I learned more in this 10-minute clip than I ever did in a semester of physics." To him, the video was efficient, a shortcut to mastery that made the textbooks look obsolete. But then the conversation took an interesting turn. I asked him a simple, fundamental question about the logical premise behind the theory he was so excited about, specifically why the interaction occurs without a physical medium. The confidence instantly vanished. He paused, struggled to find the words, and tried to describe the animation again with his hands. Finally, he slumped back and admitted, "Well, the video made it look so obvious, but I can't actually explain the logic." That moment of paralysis was a perfect, slightly unsettling illustration of what we call outsourced imagination. My friend hadn't actually engaged in the cognitive struggle of learning. The video creators had done the imagining for him, leaving him with a fleeting illusion of competence rather than deep understanding. It highlighted a massive, invisible shift happening to our collective brains. We are trading the neuro-building friction of reading for the smooth, passive intake of video, and in doing so, we might be losing the very operating system required for deep thought.
And that is, our realization is profoundly unsettling, isn't it? But it's precisely what we're going to get into in this deep dive.
It really is. We're going to investigate the physiological and even the societal implications of this huge shift, this migration from text-based deep processing to video-driven consumption.
Exactly. We've sort of labeled them for this discussion. You have the Gutenberg mind on one side.
Right, the classic deep-reading brain.
And on the other, the TikTok mind. And this isn't just about, how kids study for exams. It's about how all of us as a society conduct abstract reasoning and frankly, whether we can maintain our critical thinking skills.
So our mission today is to really unpack that trade-off. We need to understand not just the cultural shift, but what's literally happening inside our brains on a neurological level. How does this change our ability to focus, to self-correct our own thinking, to grapple with, really dense and nuanced material?
That's the core question. And to answer it, we have to build a framework. So first, we'll break down these concepts of perceptual load versus cognitive load.
Okay, because that distinction explains how media creates that illusion of competence you mentioned. Then we'll connect that to the pretty widespread crisis in critical thinking and information literacy we're seeing.
So ultimately, you, the listener, can understand that choosing between text and video isn't just about convenience.
Not at all. It's a choice about how you want your brain to work. This whole dive is really about cognitive fitness.
All right, let's start there then, this foundational shift from the Gutenberg mind to the TikTok mind. The sources frame this as a kind of exchange, where we're trading necessary friction for this very seductive fluency.
That is the essential trade-off. When we talk about the Gutenberg mind, we're talking about the deep cognitive mode that text demands. And its key feature is what you just said, neuro-building friction.
So it's supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be hard. Think about reading a complex legal document or a dense philosophy text. It forces the sustained linear focus. Your brain has to work, really work, to decode all these abstract symbols, letters, and words, and then assemble them into a coherent mental model.
So you're constantly doing this mental heavy lifting. You're holding concepts in your working memory. You're making logical jumps between paragraphs, and you're always self-monitoring, asking yourself, wait, did I really get that? Let me go back and read that again.
Precisely. And that deliberate, effortful, sequential labor, that is what strengthens our executive functions. Those are the high-level cognitive abilities, mostly in the prefrontal cortex, that handle planning, goal management, extended attention.
All the stuff that actually lets you do complex work.
Exactly. So the friction of reading, as counterintuitive as it sounds, that is the value proposition.
And the TikTok mind is basically the neurological opposite of that.
It is. It's all about smooth, passive intake, high bandwidth sensory consumption. You're getting information from visuals, sound, text on the screen, motion all at the same time.
It's so efficient.
It's so optimized for flow and engagement that it massively reduces the need for you to do any of that internal cognitive work. The focus just shifts from abstract thinking to rapid sensory assimilation.
But I still get stuck on this point. If the information is delivered so efficiently, shouldn't that, in theory, free up some mental space for deeper thinking later? Is all visual information just outsourcing our imagination?
That's a crucial question. And the short answer is No, not all of it. Visuals are fantastic for showing concrete relationships, like how a machine works or a spatial layout, but they often fall short when the core concept is fundamentally abstract.
Like quantum entanglement.
Exactly. Which brings us back to that idea of outsourced imagination.
So walk me through that moment with my friend again. Why did the video fail him, really?
Well, the video, in its effort to make this incredibly complex idea click, it gave him these beautiful, high-fidelity animations of spinning particles that are linked together. It made it all look intuitively obvious.
Right. He didn't have to build that picture in his own mind.
He didn't. The creators did all the work for him. They gave him the metaphor, the scene, the movement, everything.
So he mistook the sensory clarity of the animation for actual conceptual clarity. That's the fleeting illusion of competence.
That's it, exactly. So when you asked him to explain the logic, the concept of non-locality, the why he couldn't access it, the knowledge was just encoded with that visual image, not with the underlying conceptual framework. He could recognize the explanation if he saw it again, but he couldn't explain it or retrieve the argument's deep structure.
Which highlights the real difference then. Text forces you to do that internal construction.
It absolutely forces you. When you read a dense text on, say, general relativity, you are only given abstract symbols on a page. Your brain has to spend an enormous amount of energy building a multidimensional mental model, a whole scenario of space-time warping, mass, energy, totally from scratch.
That's the muscle building step.
That's the cognitive labor that creates durable, transferable knowledge. It forges the retrieval pathways. If a video just gives you the final construction ready-made, you skip that entire step. The knowledge feels immediate and fluent, but it's cognitively fragile.
Let's get even more physiological here, because to really get the value of reading, you have to understand just how demanding it is on the physical brain. It's not a natural process.
Not at all. It's a profound cultural invention and a very recent one in human history. To even learn how to read, the brain has to undergo this radical change, this neuroplasticity. We don't have a reading organ built in.
So the brain has to, repurpose itself?
It performs what's called neuro-recruiting. It literally repurposes neural regions that evolved for other things, like recognizing objects or faces or analyzing a complex visual scene, and it redirects them to process abstract symbols, letters, and words.
So when we learn to read, we're basically hacking our own visual system for this incredibly specific and very laborious task.
We are. The most famous example is an area called the visual word form area, or VWFA. Before you're literate, that part of your brain is involved in recognizing objects. After you learn to read, it becomes highly specialized for the rapid automatic recognition of abstract letter shapes.
But the work doesn't stop there.
No, because letters are just symbols. That information has to be immediately sent forward to the higher order networks, to the prefrontal cortex, for all that sequential analysis and logical inference and working memory.
And the sources are really clear on this. That effort, that strenuous process, that is the physiological reason reading is such a powerful cognitive workout.
Absolutely. Deep reading is a sustained training session for your prefrontal cortex. It demands that you maintain extended linear attention, a skill that is just getting hammered by our rapid consumption media diet.
So when we habitually avoid that friction, when we always choose the smooth, passive video, we're risking atrophy in the very systems we need for complex thinking.
We lose the operating system, the one required for the abstract logical work of the Gutenberg mind.
Okay, that's a perfect setup to get deeper into the media psychology here. We need to move from this general idea of cognitive labor to the specific mechanisms of resource allocation, especially with multisensory media like video.
Right.
And this is where that distinction between perceptual load and cognitive load becomes so important.
This separation is absolutely key to understanding why some videos feel easy to watch but are impossible to remember, while others feel really challenging but actually lead to deep learning. For years, media research was stuck on this question. When your brain processes visuals and audio at the same time, are they drawing from one single central resource pool, or are there separate modality-specific pools?
And breaking down the type of load provides the answer. So let's define them. Perceptual load first.
Perceptual load is all about the complexity of the sensory features themselves. You can think of it as a physical workload on your eyes or ears. The brightness, the speed of movement on the screen, the sheer density of visual information.
How busy your senses are.
Exactly how busy your senses are. Cognitive load, on the other hand, is about the meaning level, central processing. This is the complexity of the mental work you have to do. Making logical jumps, learning new rules, holding items in your working memory, trying to reconcile contradictory pieces of information.
The sources go into this really fascinating experiment that was designed to pull these two loads apart and test them. Let's walk through that setup with the Asteroid Impact video game.
It was a brilliant piece of experimental design. So you have participants playing a simple game where they're flying a ship, they're avoiding obstacles, collecting things. The critical measurement tool was something called secondary task reaction times, or STRTs.
Okay, what does that mean?
While they're totally absorbed in the game, they would occasionally see a brief visual flash or hear an auditory beep. That's the secondary task. They just had to respond to it instantly. The idea is if the main game is using up a lot of your mental resources, your response time to that flash or beep is going to be a lot slower.
So the delay tells you how hard their brain is working.
Precisely. The delay in the STRT is a really reliable measure of how many resources are currently being consumed.
And the genius of it was how they manipulated the two different types of load inside the game. So how did they crank up the visual perceptual load?
They added this intensely distracting visual overlay. They framed it in the game as a damaged spaceship display. But what it really was pure sensory noise. It wasn't intellectually challenging, it was just a bunch of rapidly changing, colorful, Mondrian-like rectangles that were constantly shifting color and location all over the screen.
So just a lot of visual chaos to process.
Total visual chaos. The visual density and speed were high, forcing the visual processing pathways to work harder, but it didn't add any new rules to the game.
And then for cognitive load, they needed something that targeted working memory and rule following without adding to the visual mess.
Exactly. So they introduced a memory task, a really difficult rule called the one-back task. Participants were told about dangerous crystals, and the rule was you cannot collect two crystals of the same color in a row.
So you constantly have to remember what you just did.
Constantly. It requires effortful self-monitoring, continuous memory, refreshing what was the last color I grabbed. An active rule application. Pure, central, cognitive labor. It put a huge demand on the executive control system.
All right, so let's get to the results, the reaction times. This is the evidence that really separates these two resource pools in the brain.
And the results were definitive. They found that perceptual load is modality specific. When they turned on that high visual perceptual load, the crazy Mondrian overlay, it significantly slowed down reaction times, but only for the visual secondary tasks.
Only for the flash?
Only for the flash. Critically, it did not significantly increase reaction times for the auditory beeps,
Wow.
which confirms that our initial sensory processing resources are housed in these parallel modality-specific pools. If your eyes are swamped processing sensory information, your auditory system at that initial stage isn't necessarily overloaded.
That makes sense from a brain structure perspective, right? Visual cortex, auditory cortex. They're different pathways, but the cognitive load part was different.
Fundamentally different. The experiment showed that cognitive load is modality general. When they introduced that one-back memory task, the rule following, it slowed down reaction times across both the visual and the auditory tasks, and by about the same amount.
So that kind of deep thinking pulls from one central shared resource pool.
It provides really strong evidence that our higher-order processing networks, the central executive system used for meaning inference learning, are shared. They get taxed no matter if the information came in through your eyes or your ears.
This is a game changer for how we should think about media. What's the so what here? How does this change how we should analyze the videos we watch?
The implication for video, especially edutainment and news, is enormous. If a video is saturated with sensory richness, fast cuts, dramatic music, busy graphics, constant motion, it's imposing a high perceptual load. It's efficiently draining your visual resources just to process the flashiness of the show.
But because it's mostly perceptual load, it might not be tapping into that central cognitive pool you need for deep understanding.
That's the risk. Your visual system is busy, but your core thinking system isn't really working hard to process the meaning or integrate the information into a durable knowledge structure. The opposite happens if a video forces you to, say, reconcile complex logical claims or memorize a series of steps. That imposes high cognitive load, and it's going to tax your central system, whether it's a dry lecture or a slick video essay.
So if I'm trying to learn something complex, and the video I'm watching has all these cool-looking graphics that are just decorative, they're actually hurting me. That visual noise is reducing my capacity to absorb the core message through that visual channel.
That is exactly correct. Unnecessary perceptual load actively reduces the processing capacity for the core content within that modality. And this insight is absolutely essential for designing better learning tools, for designing any multisensory system, really, like VR or AR. If the goal is deep comprehension, you have to minimize the extraneous perceptual load so that those precious central cognitive resources can focus entirely on processing the meaning.
It's so counterintuitive. You think more is more. But this brings up the next big point, the paradox of video's high bandwidth. You get so much sensory information, but that doesn't always lead to clearer understanding.
In fact, it can become a kind of semantic trap. This is the paradox of high bandwidth. Video bombards you with simultaneous cues, not just the words, but the speaker's microexpressions, their body language, emotional tone, music, all of it. On the one hand, this is great at reducing perceptual uncertainty. We know exactly what the speaker looks and sounds like.
But that richness can actually increase cognitive load because now you have to try and integrate all these different signals, and sometimes they might even conflict.
And that leads directly to semantic ambiguity. When the spoken words are vague, but the visual performance is incredibly confident, which cue wins?
The visual one, almost every time.
The visual emotional cue often hijacks the whole process, overriding the dry linguistic logic. This is what we call the performance as signal trap.
The corporate anecdote about the project manager, Mark, is such a perfect and high-stakes example of this.
It really is. So Mark gets a video update from his CEO about a critical pending merger. The CEO is clearly media-trained, delivering this high-bandwidth performance. He looks calm, his tone is steady and confident. He's smiling from this beautifully appointed office.
So Mark watches this, and his perceptual uncertainty just drops to zero. All the visual evidence signals competence, stability.
Right. So he reports back to his team that the merger is a sure thing. He says something like, everything is stable, the boss looks confident.
But the visual certainty came at a huge cost, didn't it?
A catastrophic cost. The performance masked devastating linguistic ambiguity. The merger was actually falling apart. If Mark had just gotten a transcript of that video and analyzed the cold, dry language, he would have seen all these non-committal phrases.
Things like, we're exploring promising avenues.
We remain optimistic pending key milestones. And the wheel killer, we're preparing for all eventualities. It was all managerial hedging, deliberately non-specific. But the visual performance, that confident smile, was processed as the definitive signal of stability.
And the result was a disaster. Layoff started 2 days later, and his whole team was blindsided because he processed the confidence instead of the content.
It's a perfect illustration of how the high-bandwidth video experience prioritizes these peripheral, social, emotional cues over the actual diagnostic cues of logical validity or factual density. Our brains are just wired to rapidly evaluate social signals. Is this person a threat? Are they confident? And when there's this overwhelming visual input, those signals often hijack the resources that should be focused on deconstructing the language.
And that hijacking effect is even more potent when emotion is the main ingredient, which is a huge driver of how misinformation goes viral online.
Oh, absolutely. Research confirms that highly emotive information content designed to trigger visceral feelings like anger or fear or deep sadness is prioritized in our early visual attention. We're psychologically wired to pay attention to it, and that dramatically increases the odds we'll share it.
Which brings us to the story of Sarah and the housing crisis documentary.
Right. So Sarah watches this viral video that's supposed to educate her on a local housing crisis. It's high bandwidth, it's got haunting piano music, dramatic editing, close-ups of tearful families, a narrator whose voice is just filled with righteous indignation.
And a package.
The whole package. And this powerful emotional performance, this high bandwidth delivery, it completely convinces Sarah that she understands the issue.
But the deep understanding wasn't in the video. It was in the boring documents.
Precisely. The emotional resonance bypassed her critical filters entirely. It caused her to completely overlook the complex, dry, text-based city council documents that actually detailed the problem. And those documents revealed that the quote-unquote villains in the video were actually proposing this complicated bureaucratic solution that, while it was unpopular and slow, it actually addressed the root cause.
So she confused the feeling of being informed and compassionate with actually being factually informed.
She did. The high emotion distracted her from the diagnostic cues, from logical validity and factual precision. The TikTok mind environment, which is so optimized for speed and emotional resonance, it actively works against the rigorous, dry, logical processing that the Gutenberg mind needs to sift signal from all that emotional noise.
So these cognitive trade-offs we've been talking about, the preference for fluency over friction, the vulnerability to emotional cues, this has to lead somewhere. And the data suggests it's leading to a documented societal crisis in critical thinking and information literacy.
It is, and the sources establish this really stark contrast between how we talk about the problem and how we actually behave.
Everyone agrees critical thinking is important, but nobody thinks they have a problem with it.
The consensus is huge. 95% of people believe critical thinking is necessary in today's world. About 80% believe young people lack these skills. But this awareness comes with this massive reality gap. When you ask people about themselves, 67% confidently state that their own reasoning skills have improved over time.
So we're great at seeing the problem in other people, but we all overestimate our own cognitive rigor.
And that overestimation shows up in these concrete failures of how we research things. The reported behaviors are, well, they're alarming. Nearly half, 47% of respondents admit they don't typically plan where they're going to get information when they research something. They just sort of assume the answer will pop up on Google.
And even worse, about a quarter of people rely on just one source to make a decision.
Think about that, almost 27%. Imagine the professional and civic cost of basing major decisions, from what to invest in to who to vote for, on the very first source that loads, or the one source that just confirms what you already believe. It's a total abdication of cognitive responsibility.
And this failure to practice strategic thinking, it's even showing up in how we teach or don't teach these skills.
Yeah, the sources highlight a real deficit in how we model critical thought, especially for parents. You have 87% of parents who agree that asking a child to consider an opposing view is a useful exercise, but only 20% of them frequently or daily actually do it.
Wow.
And only about a third regularly have their kids discuss issues that don't have a clear right or wrong answer. Only 26% frequently help their children evaluate evidence. If you don't build that scaffolding for cognitive friction early on, it's exponentially harder to adopt it later in life, especially in this high-speed media environment.
And when you look specifically at that online environment, the deficits around source credibility they're just stark. We are defaulting to pure convenience.
The data on online literacy points to a real collapse in the hierarchy of credibility. Over a third of all respondents consider Wikipedia, a crowdsourced website, to be the equivalent of a thoroughly vetted encyclopedia.
And that's worse with younger people.
Much worse. It's 48% of younger respondents, 18 to 40, who equate Wikipedia with an encyclopedia, compared to just 25% of older respondents. It shows this profound failure to distinguish between expert-verified knowledge and just rapidly aggregated public knowledge.
And there was that study that visually demonstrated this habit of cognitive convenience, the heat map study.
That was fascinating. Researchers tracked where people clicked when they were researching topics. And when people searched for something like the U.S. Capitol, the heat map showed they were almost just as likely to click on the Wikipedia result as they were the official government website.
It's not a conscious choice, it's a habit.
It's a failure to employ critical evaluation. The brain just defaults to what's familiar, what's high up in the search results, or what looks aesthetically pleasing, rather than doing the high-friction work of asking, okay, where did this information come from? Is this source reliable?
And when you pair that cognitive convenience with our natural confirmation bias, the problem just explodes. We're actively building our own echo chambers.
The drive towards homophily seeking out people and information that align with what we already believe is so deeply ingrained. Less than a quarter of respondents actively seek out views that challenge their own. And conversely, 24% actively avoid people with opposing views.
We're avoiding the discomfort of disagreement.
At the expense of comprehensive understanding, it's a recipe for societal myopia, and it just completely hinders reasoned debate.
And the ultimate consequence of this low-friction environment and this avoidance of critical thought is our massive susceptibility to misinformation, mostly because we're just relying on intuition.
Misinformation spreads so effectively because people go with their gut check instead of sustained, careful deliberation. The illusory truth effect is a core mechanism here. Just simple repetition makes a claim seem more believable, even if it's completely false.
And that works even if you know better.
It works regardless of your cognitive ability, and even if you have prior knowledge that directly contradicts the claim. The brain just substitutes familiarity and processing fluency, how easy it is to process the claim, for factual validity.
And it's important to stress, this isn't just about politics. It's about intellectual rigor.
Right. The crucial finding from one study was that participants who were just demonstrably better at analytical, non-intuitive tasks like solving brain teasers that require effortful thought, they were also significantly better at telling fake headlines from real ones.
So there's a direct link.
A direct link between lazy or intuitive thinking and your vulnerability to misinformation. The preference of the TikTok mind for speed and fluency just predisposes us to accept information that feels right or familiar, bypassing the complex, high-friction analysis needed to actually check if it's true.
Okay, so misinformation gets into our cognitive system because it's easy and it feels fluent. But once it's in there, getting it out is incredibly difficult, even when you have clear, factual evidence. This is the continued influence effect.
The continued influence effect, or CIE, is the central challenge in all of debunking. Misinformation keeps its persuasive power over your reasoning, your decisions, your inferences about an event, even after you've received and can recall an explicit correction.
Why does it stick around? It seems so illogical for the brain to hang on to something it knows is false.
The mechanism is all about our memory models. When you learn corrective information, the original misinformation isn't just erased or overwritten like changing a file on a hard drive. Instead, the false information and the true correction, they coexist in your memory. They're often in direct competition.
And the problem is, which one gets retrieved?
Exactly. The original misinformation was often strongly integrated into your initial mental model of the event. So later, when your brain needs to reason about that event, to make a decision or explain the cause, it often pulls up the misinformation first, just because it's already well connected and comes to mind effortlessly due to familiarity.
So the brain prefers a complete story, even if it's a false one, because it's easier to retrieve.
It prefers a causally coherent narrative. A simple retraction, just saying, the claim that the fire was caused by arson is false, is often not enough because it creates a gap in the person's mental model.
A narrative vacuum.
A narrative vacuum. The brain is left with an incomplete story. There was a fire, but the cause is suddenly missing. That gap is cognitively uncomfortable, and the brain will often default back to the false explanation just to restore the causal narrative, simply because it's a complete story that explains the outcome.
So the most effective correction strategies have to focus on filling that void.
Precisely. The most effective strategy by far is providing a plausible alternative explanation. One that fills the gap and explains why the misinformation was false. So instead of just retracting the arson claim, the correction has to state, the fire was caused by a lightning strike, which is corroborated by meteorological data, and the initial report of arson was based on unreliable testimony.
You're giving the brain a new, complete story to latch onto.
A new, complete causal narrative that can compete effectively with the original lie. It provides a more durable memory hook.
Are there any other practical things that make corrections more successful, especially in this TikTok mind environment that demands speed?
Well, corrections benefit from using detailed factual refutations, the more specific the better, but you have to deliver them in simple, clear language. Graphical presentations can really help with comprehension and retention as long as the graphics are informational, low perceptual load, not just distracting eye candy.
And what about worldview? Does it help if the correction comes from a source you trust?
It does. Worldview bias is very real. People tend to distrust corrections from sources that challenge their values. But studies show that even worldview-threatening corrections still usually have some beneficial impact. The key takeaway, though, is always never leave an information void open.
Since reactive debunking is so hard because of the CIE, it seems like the focus really has to shift to building cognitive immunity before we're exposed. This is where pre-bunking comes in.
Yes. Shifting from reactive correction debunking to preemptive defense pre-bunking is crucial for the future of information literacy. The whole approach is based on inoculation theory.
Like a vaccine for misinformation.
Exactly like a vaccine. The goal is to build resilience before the misinformation is ever encountered. The intervention has two steps. First, you warn people about the threat of misleading persuasion. And second, you identify the specific rhetorical and visual techniques that are used to mislead.
So you're not correcting a specific lie about, say, climate change. You're teaching people how to spot the technique of cherry-picking data, or the tactic of using fake experts to bolster a weak claim.
That's it. This equips the individual with a set of cognitive tools, these critical thinking lenses, that let them identify similar persuasion attempts in the future on any topic. It creates this umbrella of protection. It's far more durable than just memorizing one specific fact correction.
And when it comes to navigating the high-speed, high-bandwidth web, What's the single most important advanced literacy skill we should all be practicing?
It's arguably lateral reading. Given everything we know about how people struggle to evaluate source credibility and just fall back on their gut, the traditional method of close reading a single website, looking for the About Us page, is just not enough anymore.
So what is lateral reading?
Lateral reading requires you to actively open new browser tabs and consult external sources, Google, Wikipedia, fact checkers, to check the credibility, the origins, the funding of the initial source while you are still reading it.
That's high friction effort. That's classic Gutenberg mind skills being applied to the TikTok mind environment.
It demands that we reject the passive intake model. Lateral reading forces us to acknowledge that the web is a fundamentally adversarial environment and that cognitive convenience is an incredibly dangerous trap. By practicing this strenuous act of cross-verification, we improve our discernment, we make sure we're not basing complex decisions on a single, possibly compromised source, and we proactively build the cognitive fitness we need to survive this information landscape. So to synthesize this whole journey we've taken, the cognitive shift from the Gutenberg mind to the TikTok mind is not just some technological evolution, it's a fundamental physiological reshaping of our capacity for deep abstract thought. We're gaining this incredible efficiency in consuming surface-level information and powerful emotional cues. But in that exchange, we risk allowing the essential muscle memory for complex logic, for sustained linear focus, for rigorous self-correction, the very core of critical thinking to just atrophy.
It seems like the modern media environment demands that we become intensely conscious of how we're learning and what parts of our brain are actually being used. We can't just rely on the default settings of the TikTok mind. That preference for fluency, for speed, for emotional engagement, especially when we're facing complex professional problems or dense policy documents or any kind of high-stakes decision. We have to intentionally choose to embrace the high-friction labor of critical thinking and deep reading, or else we'll end up relying solely on that outsourced imagination and the fleeting illusion of competence that it gives us.
I heard a story recently about a veteran philosophy professor, let's call him Dr. Thorne, who has been teaching the same Introduction to Logic course for over 20 years. He told a colleague that for the first time, he feels like he is teaching in a foreign language. It wasn't that the students were less intelligent, it was that their operating systems had fundamentally changed. He assigned a classic dense text on deductive reasoning, pure, linear, abstract Gutenberg material. In the past, students would wrestle with the text, complaining, but eventually decoding the logic line by line. This semester, however, a student came to his office hours looking genuinely distressed. The student admitted, "Professor, I started the page for an hour. I can't build the picture in my head. Is there a video essay that explains this?" Dr. Thorne realized that the student wasn't looking for a shortcut out of laziness. They were suffering from a lack of neuro-fitness for deep reading. Their brain, trained by the TikTok mind, was desperate for the outsourced imagination that video provides. They were waiting for a visual cue to explain the abstract concept, but the text demanded they build that structure internally. The future of understanding hinges on recognizing that we are trading the ability to internally construct complex logic for the efficiency of externally supplied visuals. And if we fail to consciously engage the friction of deep thought, the operating system required for abstract reasoning may atrophy.